They say some places remember, long after people forget. This town, quiet and aging, seemed like one of them. The kind of place where time drifts slower and stories whisper through the cracks in brick walls and under bakery doors. But sometimes, all it takes is one soul, silent, four-legged, and forgotten by the world, to stir it all awake. Welcome to Vale Marks, where true stories walk quietly beside us, waiting to be seen. Stay with us until the final moment, because what begins as a mystery will soon reveal a lesson so human it could only be told by a dog who never needed to speak. Every morning, just as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the slanted roofs of Briarwood Lane, a lone figure emerged from the shadows near the alleyway behind Everly's oven. It wasn't a baker arriving early or a customer eager for warm muffins. It was a dog. An old German shepherd with graying fur around his eyes and a quiet dignity in his stride. In his mouth, he carried a single leaf, not just any leaf. It was always a leaf from the sassafras tree, distinct in shape, almost like a mitten, and always perfectly intact, as if selected with care. The dog would walk up to the front step of the bakery, lay the leaf down gently at the door, then sit for a moment without barking or whining, and just as quietly as he came, he would turn and leave. At first, Margaret Wilson thought it was a coincidence. Leaves blew around in the autumn wind all the time. Maybe the dog was just playing, or maybe he had a habit. But then it happened again, and again, every single morning, for 6 mornings in a row. On the 7th morning, Margaret opened the door before the dog could leave. "Hey there," she said softly, unsure why her voice trembled. The dog didn't move. He sat still, his ears perked, eyes fixed on hers, eyes that didn't flicker with hunger or fear, but with something deeper, something knowing. "Are you trying to tell me something?" she asked, almost embarrassed. The dog gave no answer, only lowered his gaze respectfully, then turned and padded away. That night, Margaret lay awake in her small upstairs room above the bakery. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock her husband had once fixed with a toothpick and some glue. He had passed away 3 years ago, and since then, the bakery had become both her burden and her anchor. Their children, both grown, lived out of state, and called less than they used to. She didn't blame them. Life was busy, people moved on. But the dog hadn't moved on. And neither had the bakery. Everly's oven had been around since Margaret's grandmother opened it in the 1930s. For decades, it had been a cornerstone of the neighborhood, a place where children saved quarters for cinnamon twists, and neighbors shared news over scones and coffee. But things had changed. A gleaming supermarket had opened 4 blocks away. A drive-through cafe popped up near the highway. The old shops on Briarwood Lane were fading, one by one. Margaret had held on stubbornly. Each morning, she rose before dawn, tied her graying hair into a bun, and baked. Even when no customers came, even when the heating bill doubled and the city sent yet another notice about rezoning, and now the dog had come. On the 10th morning, she placed a biscuit outside, a small peace offering. The dog ignored it. He dropped his leaf, sat, then left. Margaret found herself watching from the window long after he disappeared. Soon, word began to spread. Jesse, the delivery boy from across the street, mentioned the dog to a customer. An older woman claimed she'd seen him sitting near the war memorial 3 nights in a row. A child pointed out that the dog had a scar near his left hind leg. "Like a soldier," he said. And always the leaf. By the end of the 2nd week, people started calling him Guardian. "It suits him," Jesse told Margaret. "He's like one of those old spirits that just never left." Margaret didn't laugh at that. She'd begun to feel it too. There was something deliberate about Guardian. His calm, his consistency, His choice of that particular tree's leaf. Sassafras trees weren't even common in that part of town. And yet, every morning, one appeared at her doorstep, delivered with reverence. She began saving the leaves, placed them carefully in a ceramic bowl near the register. Customers noticed, asked questions. Some smiled and called it sweet. Others lowered their voices and said, "That dog's been through something, you can tell," but no one knew what. On the 15th morning, Guardian came as usual. Margaret waited by the door. When he placed the leaf, she crouched slowly, extended her hand, not to pet him, but to meet him halfway. "Are you trying to remember something?" she whispered. For a brief moment, the dog stayed still, close enough that she could see the light mist on his fur, smell the faint scent of earth and old leaves. Then he stood up and walked away again, as silent as ever. Yet something had changed. Margaret could feel it in her chest. That night, she pulled out an old scrapbook. Flipping through the brittle pages, she paused at a photo of her late husband in uniform. In the corner, barely visible, was a young man beside him, Sam Tiller, who had gone missing years ago during a rescue mission. Sam had been a dog handler. She hadn't thought about him in decades, and yet, suddenly, it all came rushing back. The next morning, when Guardian arrived, Margaret was waiting with a question. "Did you know Sam?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. The dog froze. For the first time, he didn't sit. He looked up at her, ears high, tail still. Then, slowly, he walked to the edge of the porch, sat facing the old sassafras tree across the street, and waited. It was no longer just a ritual. It was a message, and Margaret was finally ready to listen. No one knew the dog's name. He had simply become the shepherd to most, an anonymous wanderer with a ritual no one could quite explain. That is, until the morning Harold Becker sat up straight in the bakery, his hand trembling slightly over a chipped ceramic mug. "I know that dog," he said, his voice gravelly but firm. "That dog saved a man's life." The bakery fell silent. Even Jesse, the usually talkative delivery kid, stopped in mid-sentence. Harold, 81 years old and a man of few words, had been a quiet fixture at Everly's oven for as long as anyone could remember. Every Tuesday morning, he ordered the same coffee and pecan scone, sat in the same corner by the window, and left $1 more than he owed. He rarely spoke to anyone but Margaret. But that day, something shifted. The moment Guardian dropped his morning leaf on the doormat and turned to leave, Harold's eyes widened, not with recognition, but with reverence. It was as if a ghost had walked by, a ghost covered in fur and silence. Margaret leaned closer to him, her brow furrowed. "You've seen him before?" "Not exactly," Harold said, "but I've seen one just like him. And I remember those eyes." He waited a long moment, looking into the steam curling from his coffee. Then he told them the story. Back in the late 90s, Harold had worked with the county's volunteer emergency response team, search and rescue mostly. There had been a young man named Sam Tiller who joined with a dog named Guardian. Sam was in his 20s, fresh-faced, idealistic, but the dog, Guardian, was something else entirely. Focused, fearless, almost human in the way he moved through disaster zones. "They were like shadows," Harold said. "You'd blink and find them already at the heart of a wreck, guiding a survivor out." Then came the mudslide. A sudden violent downpour triggered a collapse in a remote area of Briar Ridge Forest. Sam and Guardian were sent in with a small team. Hours passed, then a day. Only Guardian came back. "We found him alone," Harold said, his voice catching slightly. "Soaked, bruised, limping, but still breathing." Guardian refused food, ignored commands, and wouldn't leave the edge of the forest. Then, after 2 nights of sitting vigil, he vanished. "We thought he went off to die," Harold said. Or maybe he was looking for Sam. Either way, no one ever saw him again. Margaret stared at Guardian through the front window. He had taken up his usual place across the street, under the sassafras tree, watching the bakery as if guarding something sacred. "But why now?" Jessie asked, leaning in. "Why come back after all this time?" Harold shrugged, his weathered hands clasped together. Maybe he found something. Or maybe he remembered something we forgot. Margaret felt a chill crawl up her spine. The leaves, the silence. The timing, it wasn't random. Guardian wasn't just returning for nostalgia. He was trying to say something. That evening, Jessie came back with his laptop. "I did some digging," he said. "Remember that area where the landslide happened? The one from Harold's story? It's been owned by Wells Development for the past 2 years. Margaret looked up. "The real estate company?" "Yeah. They're getting permits to demolish the forest edge and build a luxury resort. Condos, golf course, the works." "And no one's protesting?" she asked. Jessie shook his head. "It's not public land anymore. They're framing it as a revitalization effort." Harold snorted from the corner. "Revitalizing what? Paving over memory?" That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, flipping through old town archives Jessie had printed for her. There were maps, property lines, even satellite images. And tucked into the corner of one article was a photo. Sam and Guardian, standing near the trailhead at Briar Ridge. Behind them stood a carved wooden post. A trail marker, almost hidden by time. The carving on it, a sassafras leaf. She blinked. Suddenly, the leaves Guardian brought didn't feel symbolic. They were practical. Markers, coordinates. He wasn't just remembering. He was leading. The next morning, Margaret stepped outside before Guardian could place the leaf. "Where are you trying to take us?" she asked softly. The dog didn't move, but his eyes held hers. He looked down at the leaf he had just dropped, then up again. And for the first time he turned, but didn't leave. He waited. "Margaret," Jessie called, hurrying down the sidewalk. "I think I found something else." There was a report, an unofficial one, from a local ranger. Said there were signs someone had camped near the old trailhead. Fresh paw prints, disturbed earth. Margaret's breath caught. Could it be? "I think Guardian's been there," Jessie said. "Recently." For the next hour they sat in the bakery and sketched out what they knew. Guardian had come back after years of silence. He brought leaves from a specific tree. He led them to remember Sam, the man who vanished. And now, with the forest at risk of being erased completely, he had returned. Not for attention. Not for food, but for a promise. "A dog doesn't remember like people do," Harold said. "But a canine, he remembers duty and loyalty. He remembers the last thing he was told." Margaret touched the photo of Sam and Guardian again. "What if that last thing," she said, "was to keep Sam's secret safe?" Outside, the sun filtered through the trees. Guardian stood, his tail steady, his gaze locked on the road leading toward Briar Ridge, toward the past. Toward truth. They had been given a second chance, and this time they would follow. It was the leaf that changed everything, not because it was different in color or shape, but because it was stained, with a smear of blood, dry and dark, clinging to one corner. Margaret noticed it the moment she stepped outside. It was Guardian's usual time. He had left the leaf at her doorstep just like always. But today, something was off. The dog wasn't there. No shadow across the street. No familiar figure, watching from beneath the sassafras tree. She knelt and picked up the leaf gently, her stomach tightening. A drop of blood. And faintly, on the dew-covered sidewalk, paw prints and smaller footprints headed away from the bakery, curving toward the alley, then disappearing behind the shuttered hardware store. Margaret didn't think. She grabbed her coat, told Jessie to keep watch over the counter, and followed the trail. The prints led her down past the park, through a gap in a rusting chain-link fence, and finally to a forgotten part of the neighborhood, a wide lot behind the old train depot, where nothing had stood for years except a hollowed-out warehouse, walls crumbling like stale bread. There, behind a stack of dented pallets and rain-warped cardboard boxes, she found him. A boy. No older than 10, curled up beside a small, injured puppy with a bandage wrapped in strips of an old t-shirt, and watching over them, lying low but alert, was Guardian. The boy looked up, startled, his eyes wide and afraid. His dirty hands clutched the puppy closer. "I won't hurt you," Margaret said softly, both hands in the air. "I just saw the blood. I wanted to make sure everyone was okay." The boy didn't answer. Guardian didn't move either. He only gave a low whine, like a whisper caught in the wind. Margaret slowly crouched, her knees creaking under the strain. "Is that your puppy?" The boy nodded once. His eyes darted toward Guardian, then back to her. "I didn't take him," he said quickly. "He was hurt. I found him by the creek. I didn't steal him." "No one's accusing you," Margaret replied gently. "What's your name?" "Tyler," he said. "Tyler Mays." That name rang no bells. But the sadness in his voice did. She remembered that sound, the tremble of someone who hadn't been believed in a very long time. "My name's Margaret," she said. "I have a bakery, and it's warm there. You and your little friend look like you could use warm." He hesitated, eyes narrowing. "People usually call someone when they find me." "I'm not someone," Margaret said, standing up. "I'm just a lady with a tired back and a kitchen full of bread no one eats before noon." That made him blink. "And Guardian?" she asked. "Is he your dog?" Tyler looked down. "Not really, but I think he knew my mom." Margaret tilted her head. "She used to talk about him," Tyler continued, his voice softer. "She said there was a dog once who helped her find her way home when she was little, said if I ever got lost, he might come for me too." Margaret felt a sharp ache in her chest. "What happened to your mom?" "She got sick. Then she got tired of the people who came around with clipboards. So she just stopped letting them in." Margaret didn't push further. She didn't need to. There were too many stories like Tyler's, quiet disappearances in between the lines of official reports. Instead, she held out her hand. Tyler looked at it for a long time. Then, slowly, he reached out his own. It was the first time, he would later say, that someone touched him without flinching. Without pulling away, without putting on gloves, she led him back to Everly's oven. Guardian walked beside them, his steps calm and quiet. The puppy, whom Tyler had named Sprout, nestled in a basket Margaret once used for bread rolls. That night, Margaret gave Tyler a blanket and a corner of the bakery's back room, where an old daybed still stood. She didn't ask too many questions. She just let him be. He stayed. Days passed. Tyler learned how to knead dough, how to tell when scones were done just by smell, how to fold parchment paper into perfect triangles. He had a natural rhythm in the kitchen, like someone who had spent years watching things rise and fall. "Dough's just like people," he told her once. "It acts better when you give it space to breathe." Margaret laughed more than she had in years. In return, he taught her things too. Like how silence could be comforting, not empty, how little details, a worn shoelace, a cracked teacup, carried stories if you paid attention, and how even broken things, like an abandoned puppy or a tired heart, still wanted to be held. Guardian never came inside, not once. He slept just outside the door, his head resting on his paws, always watching. Always waiting. Margaret began to understand. Guardian was the thread between them all, the boy without a home, the widow without a family, the puppy learning to walk again. He had gathered the lost, the scared, and the scarred and brought them to one another. He didn't need to speak. He had already said everything in the way he stayed. Each night, as Margaret turned out the lights, she would glance at the front stoop and whisper, "You can come in, you know." But Guardian never moved. He had made a promise long ago, one tied to something deeper than comfort, something unfinished. And Margaret, for the first time in a long while, didn't feel the need to ask for more. She simply whispered, "Thank you." And in the stillness, the dog lifted his head, just slightly, and blinked once, slow and certain, as if to say, "You're welcome, but I'm not done yet." Under the bakery floor, a forgotten world had waited. It started innocently enough. Jesse had been reorganizing boxes in the storage room when he noticed a draft coming from behind a shelving unit. Curiosity piqued. He pushed the shelf aside and found a trapdoor Margaret had never noticed before, its edges covered in dust and forgotten flour. "It's locked," Jesse said, brushing his fingers over the iron ring. "But not sealed. This isn't new." Harold, who'd stopped by for his usual coffee, froze when he saw it, his brow furrowed. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "I thought they sealed these off back in the 70s. "What is it?" Margaret asked, arms crossed, trying not to sound unsettled. "Underground access tunnels," Harold said. "Used to connect most of the storefronts when this town was barely a town. My grandfather helped dig one." Jesse glanced at Guardian, who had come to sit beside them. The dog stared at the trapdoor, ears twitching, posture tense, as if he'd been waiting for this very moment. "Do you think he's been trying to lead us here all along?" Jesse asked. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she knelt, opened the lock with an old key she'd once found in the original register drawer, and lifted the door. A cold breath of earth and time whooshed up from the darkness. They descended with flashlights and gloves, the air growing cooler with each step. The tunnel was wide enough for two to walk side by side, lined with bricks turned slick by years of condensation. Tree roots had broken through in places, and old light fixtures hung lifeless from the ceiling. Tyler walked beside Guardian, who moved with slow, deliberate steps. Not a single wrong turn. Not even a pause for doubt. "This place feels like a memory," Tyler whispered. Harold led the way to an old junction where 4 tunnels met. "Back then," he said, shining his light on a rusted directional sign, "this connected Everly's, the old post office, and the town records hall." They stopped at a partial cave-in, bricks scattered like bones. Guardian stepped forward, nudged a loose rock with his paw, and sat down. "This is it," Harold said, almost under his breath. "I remember now. Sam, he told me once, if something ever went wrong with the project, if the corporation tried to cover things up, he'd hide the truth down here." "Why here?" Jesse asked. Harold shrugged. "Because no one ever looks underground anymore." They started digging, first by hand, then with borrowed tools Jesse ran back to grab. Hours passed. Tyler worked silently beside Margaret, his small hands dust-covered and bleeding slightly from the rough stone. "You don't have to keep going," Margaret told him gently. He looked up, stubborn. "I want to." It was Tyler who first heard the hollow sound of a knock against wood. They cleared away more debris and unearthed a small wooden box, the kind you might find in an attic tucked between photo albums and forgotten medals. Inside was everything, old documents labeled with Sam Tiller's name. A data drive with archived video files, a GPS device marked with coordinates, a letter, handwritten and folded, that began with, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it." The footage on the drive, played back that night in Margaret's kitchen, showed drone images of the forest before the landslide, heavy machinery working beyond approved limits. It showed Sam arguing with a Wells development foreman. It included a report, time-stamped, stating that unstable ground near Briar Ridge was disturbed without proper environmental clearance. Margaret's hand covered her mouth. They knew. They rushed it, Harold said. They pushed through permits before the soil reports cleared, and Sam, he tried to stop them. The GPS coordinates on the device matched the spot where Guardian had been lingering, where Sam was last seen. But the box held one more surprise, a folded town map dated back nearly a century. It outlined the original zoning boundaries of Everly's district. And there, in faded red ink, was a stamp that read, Historical District, exempt from commercial redevelopment. Jessie looked up. Wait, this whole block? It wasn't supposed to be sold. No, Margaret whispered. It was supposed to be protected. They sat in silence, the weight of the truth pressing down like the ceiling of the tunnel itself. Guardian lay nearby, eyes closed but ears still twitching, present but calm, as if he had done what he came to do, for now. Tyler spoke quietly. He was never lost. He was remembering. Harold nodded. He remembered the promise, and the place, and the man who believed in doing the right thing. That night something shifted. Not just in the bakery, but in the heart of everyone who had touched the box, who had seen those images, who had held those documents in trembling hands. It was no longer a story about one man's death or one dog's return. It was about a whole town. A truth buried beneath brick and time. A community that had been told it no longer mattered. That its history could be sold off, erased, paved over. But history has teeth, and sometimes it comes back on four legs, with a leaf in its mouth and a mission in its heart. As Margaret stood outside the bakery the next morning, watching Guardian sit beneath the sassafras tree, she whispered, "We found it." The dog didn't move. But she saw the way his tail thumped once against the dirt, and deep below their feet, the tunnel waited, no longer just a relic of the past, but a bridge to something more, a reckoning. A beginning, a voice, finally heard. The day the trucks rolled into town, Guardian didn't move from the base of the sassafras tree. The rumble of engines echoed down Briarwood Lane, shaking loose a few autumn leaves from the branches overhead. A construction foreman in a bright orange vest barked into a walkie-talkie, while workers in steel-toed boots surveyed the area like it already belonged to them. And standing perfectly still in the center of it all, with his ears low and eyes locked on the machines, was Guardian. He didn't bark. He didn't run. But when the lead machine came too close, the old dog let out a deep, guttural growl that stopped everyone in their tracks. It wasn't a sound of fear. It was a warning, a sound with memory behind it, a voice from the past rising through the soil to speak again. Margaret stood on the bakery steps, watching the scene unfold. A representative from Wells Development, dressed in a crisp black suit far too polished for a dusty town like theirs, approached her with papers in hand. "You're in violation of pending development codes," the man said flatly. "This property falls within the revised business district as determined by county reassessment. We're authorized to clear the site within 72 hours. Margaret's fingers tightened around the worn fabric of her apron. "You have no right." "We have paperwork," the man replied. "Do you have a lawyer?" Jesse, standing beside her with his camera phone ready, muttered, "We've got more than a lawyer." But later that night, his video, footage of Guardian growling, of the confrontation, of Tyler standing protectively in front of the bakery, was mysteriously flagged and removed from every platform he tried to upload it to. Comments disappeared. Messages were silenced. Even the neighbors, who had once cheered for the dog and smiled at Tyler's resilience, grew quiet. They lowered their shades, turned their heads. It was as if the town itself had flinched. Margaret couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling fan in her bedroom, the blades spinning slow and steady, like the passing days that were slipping through her fingers. "What am I doing?" she whispered. In the silence, she heard the creak of floorboards below. Tyler shifting restlessly in his sleeping bag near the kitchen. Sprout, the little injured pup, whimpered softly in his sleep. And Guardian? He hadn't left the front yard. All night he lay beneath the sassafras tree, his body still, his gaze locked on the horizon, as though waiting for something or someone. The next morning, Harold returned with a thick, weathered ledger in his hands. He placed it on Margaret's kitchen table with the care of someone handling fragile treasure. "This," he said, "is the list." Inside were names, hundreds of them. Dates, handwritten letters, old newspaper clippings, thank you notes. People who had been pulled from floods, fires, landslides, all of them saved by Sam and Guardian during their years in the Canine Rescue Unit. "I started this after the landslide," Harold said. "Couldn't let their memory fade." Margaret turned each page with trembling hands. Stories she'd never heard. Names from towns miles away. Lives that would have ended, but didn't. "Call them," she whispered. "What?" "Call every single one." Jesse, who'd spent the morning cursing at his laptop and scrubbing through backup files, looked up. "You really think they'll come?" "They might not," Margaret said, "but they deserve to know what's happening." Jesse nodded and began typing. Outside, Tyler sat beside Guardian, his small hand resting gently on the dog's fur. The boy hadn't spoken much since the men came. That morning, he'd refused breakfast and spent hours sitting on the porch steps, clutching Sprout like a lifeline. "Are we gonna lose the bakery?" he finally asked. Margaret knelt beside him. "I don't know." He looked away. "Feels like every place I go gets taken away." She touched his shoulder gently. "Not this time." That night, the bakery remained dark. No oven hum, no clinking pans. Margaret stood at the counter, staring at the dough she'd prepared out of habit, and then, without thinking, she began folding. One small fold, then another. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately. The shape came to life almost instinctively. Wide at the top, narrow at the bottom, veined with knife-edge lines. A leaf. She placed it on a baking sheet and made another. Dozens of them, each one like a memory given form. When they finished baking, she lined them up by the window, their golden crusts warm against the glass. In the morning, people would pass by and wonder. Some might stop and ask. Others might remember something that had long been buried. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Because in that moment, as Guardian lifted his head under the tree, and Tyler pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, Margaret realized something. This wasn't just a bakery. It was a heartbeat. A small but defiant thrum against the silence of greed. A place where people had once gathered, once cared, once remembered. And now, thanks to an old dog who refused to forget, and a boy who still believed, maybe they would again. It began with a single leaf. Not in Guardian's mouth this time, but drifting gently from the sassafras tree that towered beside the bakery. The wind carried it down like a whisper, laying it at the foot of the sleeping dog, who, for the first time in days, finally rested. But by mid-morning, leaves were everywhere. Not just from the tree, not just from Guardian. They came in people's hands, tucked in shirt pockets, woven into coat buttons. Leaves brought by neighbors, travelers, strangers, every one of them silently answering a call no one had spoken aloud. The first to arrive was a young woman in a yellow raincoat, her camera bag bouncing at her hip. Her name was Lily Mendez, a rookie reporter from the next county over, barely 23, and the only one willing to publish Jesse's footage. She had seen Guardian once, long ago, when she was only a child. She'd gotten lost during a family hike in the hills, and it was Guardian who had found her, mud-streaked, scared, curled under a log. He didn't bark. He simply lay beside her until help arrived, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw something she never forgot: steady courage, soft and quiet. Lily's article had gone viral overnight. She titled it, "The Dog Who Carried a Town's Memory." Now the townspeople returned, and this time they did not stay behind curtains. At first it was just a trickle, an old couple, then a pair of teenagers with leaf crowns on their heads. By 10 o'clock, Briarwood Lane was filled with hundreds, men in flannel, women in aprons. Schoolchildren with wrinkled leaves clutched in their small hands. Jessie stood on a milk crate near the door of Everly's oven, holding up a sign that read, "We remember." Harold, dressed in his old army jacket, walked slowly to the front of the crowd. He nodded to Jessie, then cleared his throat. "Some of you don't know me," he began, "but you know this dog, maybe not by name. Maybe not by sight, but he's saved more people in this town than most men ever will." He opened the ledger on the folding table. "These are names. Families, moments that would have ended if it weren't for Sam and for Guardian." A hush fell over the crowd. "Today we don't just stand for a dog," Harold continued, voice firm. "We stand for memory, for dignity, for every quiet act of loyalty that never made the news." Then, from the doorway of the bakery, Tyler stepped out. He was nervous, hands shaking, voice barely above a whisper. But Guardian's steady gaze from beneath the tree seemed to lend him strength. "This is my mom's journal," he said. "She used to talk about a dog with eyes like stars. Said if I ever got lost, he'd find me. She wasn't wrong." He opened the notebook and began to read. Passages about dreams, about a life too hard but not without wonder, about Sam and his dog. About a hope that the forest would stay, that children could grow up somewhere green and safe. Margaret stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. When Tyler finished, there were tears, not just on the boy's cheeks, but in dozens of eyes across the crowd. Then Margaret stepped forward and lifted the small wooden box they had retrieved from the tunnels beneath the bakery. "This," she said, "is truth." She opened the lid, revealing photographs, maps, a GPS drive, and the last known footage of Sam, the canine handler who had disappeared trying to stop a reckless land deal. "We're giving this to the sheriff's office today," Margaret continued. "And to every journalist who still believes in honesty. You can try to erase videos from the internet, but you cannot erase people." As she stepped down, a police officer moved forward and took the box carefully, respectfully, as if it were something sacred. An hour later, a subpoena was filed against Wells Development. The town clerk confirmed the original land zoning. A federal investigator arrived by afternoon. But amid the movement, the noise, and the rising storm of headlines, one figure remained still. Guardian lay beneath the sassafras tree, a single golden-brown leaf resting gently in his mouth. He didn't stand. He didn't bark. For the first time since Sam vanished, he simply closed his eyes and slept. A real, deep, unburdened sleep. No more patrol, no more watching, because at last the world had seen. And it was listening. Children laid flowers beside him. Some of the older townsfolk brought scraps of cloth with their family names embroidered. A little girl placed her teddy bear near his paws. No one disturbed him, not even the press. Because Guardian was more than a dog. He was the story. He was the reason an old bakery survived, the reason a lost boy found a home, the reason memories long buried finally rose like morning mist. And in that quiet afternoon, filled with leaves, faces, and truth, something changed. A town remembered. Not just a dog's loyalty, but their own. The air in Briarwood smelled different now, not of ash or machinery. Not of fear, but of cinnamon, warm bread, and the faint, earthy sweetness of sassafras, leaves dancing in the breeze. 1 year had passed since Guardian's last vigil beneath the tree. The gnarled roots of that sassafras had grown deeper, stronger, as if drawing power from the very memory buried beneath its shade. And now, just outside the old bakery door, a new sprout, thin, uncertain but alive, pushed its way up from the soil. Tyler stood next to it, his fingers stained with earth. He looked older, not in age, but in presence. At 11, he carried himself like someone who had learned to stay when others ran, to listen when others shouted, and to love without question. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a single leaf. Without a word, he laid it at the foot of the sprouting tree, then turned toward the bakery. Everly's Oven was no longer just a bakery. It was the heart of the neighborhood. The town council had voted unanimously to classify the surrounding blocks as a historical preservation site. Wells Development withdrew their project under public pressure, their permits revoked. What was once seen as a dying corner of the city now pulsed with visitors, curiosity, and quiet reverence. Inside, the smell of honey rolls and maple glaze lingered in the air. Laughter bounced from wall to wall. Children leaned over the long wooden counter, watching dough rise through the oven window. Elderly neighbors came not just for pastries but for conversation and warmth. Margaret sat at her usual spot behind the register, a light apron tied around her waist, her once gray hair now clipped short and flecked with flour. She glanced at Tyler, who was showing 2 younger kids how to braid cinnamon twists. "Gentle hands but firm, like telling dough a secret," he said. Margaret smiled. The boy who once hid in an abandoned warehouse was now her apprentice, her family. But Tyler wasn't the only one who'd changed. Sprout had grown into a strong young German shepherd with amber eyes and a sharp nose. He'd picked up Guardian's habits without being taught, circling the bakery perimeter every morning, watching the door during business hours, and settling near the back gate at night. Sometimes he would sit by the same corner Guardian used to favor, head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. Above that spot hung a framed photo of Guardian, taken by Jesse the day after the protest. The old dog's eyes looked out over the bakery, calm and piercing. Beneath the image, carved in simple lettering, was a phrase Harold had once whispered. He didn't bark. He pointed. Jesse had taken the phrase and turned it into the slogan of his new delivery service, Leaf Route. He ran it from a small station next to the bakery, using bicycles and wagons to bring goods across town with no emissions and plenty of charm. Each delivery came with a handmade card, one side printed with a sassafras leaf, the other with a short quote or memory from a local resident. Miss Eunice's first peach pie. Tommy's birthday, when the whole cake fell and no one cared. Guardian watched over us. Some were funny. Some were quiet. But every card was a thread in the fabric that stitched the town back together. Harold had taken to writing again. He hosted a weekly story circle at the bakery every Thursday morning, where veterans, children, bakers, and poets sat side by side and told truths too long tucked away. Margaret often listened more than she spoke, but one Thursday she finally told the story of her first night sleeping soundly after Guardian came. How she had left the door unlocked, something she hadn't done in over 20 years. How the sound of his paws pacing on the porch was the lullaby she didn't know she'd been waiting for. No one interrupted her. No one looked away, because everyone in Briarwood now knew what silence could mean and what presence could heal. That fall, the bakery hosted a leaf festival. Children folded leaves into origami. Painters created murals of Guardian beneath sassafras trees. The mayor unveiled a plaque on the sidewalk, in memory of Guardian and all the unseen protectors who guide us home. Tyler planted another tree that day, his third. He didn't say much, just knelt in the dirt, patting down the soil around the roots, and as the crowd applauded, a single leaf floated down and landed gently on Sprout's head. He didn't move. He just sat, watching, just like Guardian once had. That night, as stars blinked into the velvet sky, Margaret stood by the bakery window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Tyler slept soundly in the room upstairs. Sprout dozed by the door, his ears twitching at distant crickets. She thought about how strange it was that a leaf, something so small, had carried so much. A memory, a promise, a guidepost, and she thought about Guardian, somewhere beyond all this, no longer needing to walk the streets, because he had left behind something stronger than footprints. He had planted roots. And in this town, when roots grow deep, no storm, no machine, no silence could ever sweep them away. Margaret turned off the bakery light, whispering into the warm night, "Rest well, Guardian. Your watch is over." And outside, as the wind gently rustled the sassafras branches, it almost sounded like a tail thumping softly in reply. If you've made it to this point, thank you, from the depths of our hearts. Stories like Guardians don't just entertain, they awaken something quiet and sacred within us, the parts we often leave behind in the rush of everyday life. If this journey moved you, even just a little, I invite you to join our growing family here at Vale Marks. Subscribing is more than clicking a button. It's planting a leaf of your own into a soil that nurtures love, memory, and meaning. With just 1,000 subscribers, this channel will have the strength to continue breathing life into forgotten corners, loyal companions, and unspoken promises. In the words of Fred Rogers, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. And that's what we hope to offer, a space where the mentionable becomes unforgettable. This story was more than about a dog. It was about healing, about second chances, and about the quiet heroes among us, young, old, furred, or fragile, who remind us that love doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in the form of a leaf. Please leave us a comment. Your reflections are not only welcome, they are the compass that helps us grow. And don't forget to subscribe. Because the next story we tell might be the one your heart's been waiting for. At Vale Marks, every whisper matters, and every soul, human or canine, deserves to be heard. Thank you for watching, and thank you for believing.